Welcome to the second episode in this mini-series on how to train around injuries. In today's episode, we're going to look at elbow injuries. Specifically, I'm going to use the example of golfer's and tennis elbow, which are different types of tendinopathies. Like I said in the first episode, if you want to know more details about the specific injuries, then please go and Google that and look for any medical advice from a professional. But for today's example, I'm going to be teaching you on how to train, condition and keep finger strength despite having elbow tendinopathy or golfer's and tennis elbow. So we can look at the particular movements that are useful for you and also how to train your fingers whilst having these issues. Like I said in the previous episode, I hope you've been keeping track of any pain in the sessions that you're doing and any discomfort in the next day, so your reaction to the training. You can do this using a 1 to 10 scale, so 1 being no pain at all or no reaction to the training in the morning, and 10 being extremely painful and 10 being a very bad reaction. To find out more details on that, please go back to the first episode and look at my detailed account at the start. So, elbow injuries, what we're going to do first. So trying to maintain finger strength whilst you've got elbow injuries is actually a little bit harder than you might think sometimes, depending on the extent of the injury. So like I said at the start, we're going to be looking at golfer's and tennis elbow, which can get really painful, and that's sort of either on top or inside your elbow joint. During your actual rehab and the rehab exercises you might be doing for this area, you might do eccentric or isometric movements, which is extending under contraction or holding one static position around the elbow. So we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at how to train our fingers whilst avoiding getting the elbows worst, effectively. So when we're doing any finger strength training, like with the finger injuries, I'd also recommend using an edge or a pinch block because it's a lot more controllable and it also reduces the amount of muscles involved. So for example, if we're hanging from a fingerboard, if I was hanging, the pull-up bar was a fingerboard, whenever I'm doing any sort of hanging position, I'm having to do quite a lot of work with my upper body. And it often means that there's going to be a lot more stress going through the body because I've got my full body weight hanging. And whether that's 2 arms where I'm going to need a lot of extra load or 1 arm where I use a pulley, I'm usually going to be putting a lot of stress through the elbow joint, and I'm also going to be stretching out the shoulders and trying to engage my wrist in a certain position on the board. So for example, if you're using a half crimp or a full crimp on a fingerboard, you're going to be kinking your wrist back, which does make a difference to the elbow, which I'll explain a little bit more in a second. By using the edge to do the same training, you can be a lot more controllable. You can do the movements really, really slowly, and I personally just find it a lot easier to do whilst I've had injury issues in the past. So you can pretty much do a lot of the same training whilst you've got this elbow issue using this pickup block. The key things that I would like to keep in mind for yourself is, 1, you want to make sure that you're increasing the load nice and slowly. So really slowly start to load it and really slowly reduce it. So that means if any repeater exercises, you don't want to be jolting. A lot of elbow issues in the initial phases of rehab do become a lot worse if they're being jolted and dynamic movements. So we want to increase load during each repetition nice and slowly. The next thing to focus on is the elbow position. So isometrically, it won't matter too much, but you need to find what's comfortable for you. So a really straight arm can be quite good for any elbow issues, but I actually think that it's quite good to just have a slight kink in the arm, just a tiny amount of bend, just to make sure everything's contracted and keeping that elbow joint nice and solid and all the muscles involved engaged. If you go really bent and you put in a lot of pressure through this can actually make it worse, because inevitably you're going to have a bit of movement in the elbow when you're lifting or putting down, and when it's slightly more bent, it's going to put a lot more stress through that elbow joint. So lastly is the grip positions in use. So I think this is actually quite overlooked and quite a big one, and Unfortunately, I can't give specific answers on this depending on the injury you've got, but I can give you some versions of what's worked in the past for me and other clients. So when you're in a positive grip position, like a crimp and half crimp, like I said earlier on a fingerboard, your wrist tends to kink back. And what that does is it involves this extensor muscle a lot more, which tends to play a role in tennis elbow. So the pain coming from on top of the elbow. So what we often find is if you're in a more relaxed wrist position, that can actually reduce the load more. So for example, when lifting up the weight, if I was to have a kink in my wrist, that's going to put a lot more weight going through my extensor muscles. If I let my wrist hang down, whether it's in a half crimp or open, that's going to put a lot less contraction through this muscle here, so it becomes a lot softer. You're still working those tendons in your muscles. Vice versa, if you are in this really crimpy position, and you've got a slight bend in your arm, that also could put a lot of stress through the inside of your arm as well, because you're really trying to pull from that acute position. If you relax the hand down, stay in a more open position, then it's going to be a lot better for this elbow joint once again, with only a slight bend in the elbow. So for me personally, I'd focus on trying to train those more open grip positions, pockets, and at most half crimp, and leave any sort of full crimping or pinching as well for after your elbow is feeling much better. Climbing around elbow injuries can be really frustrating, and I really sympathise with anyone who's currently got an elbow injury. I know what it feels like, and it can be quite debilitating, but there's a couple of key things to keep in mind to prevent it getting worse and also keep improving your climbing. Like with finger injuries, you can still do no hands climbing on slabs obviously, but one thing I would try to avoid is doing too much one arm climbing, because even if you're doing one arm climbing on the good arm, usually if we're seeing elbow issues on one side of the body, we can often see it coming up on the other quite easily, because it might be a systemic problem, such as tight shoulders, chest or biceps. And if you constantly work on your other arm, it can also make that sort of flare up. So try not to do too much one arm climbing. No arm climbing is best, or really bouncy work. One thing that works really well is just climbing with thumbs, because it stops you pulling down and it stops you sort of locking off deep. So climbing with thumbs is a really good way to stop yourself pulling too hard with one arm, or starting to crank a bit hard and you think you can, because it's quite easy to do that when you're slab climbing. So the next thing you can do is focus on some really specific techniques, and I think this is a really good time to practice this. So a really good example of what to work on is if you're working any sort of erect climbs where your arms are going to be relatively straight all the time and you're working really balancing movements. Because if you're using this with heel hooks and toe hooks, you can work on your balance points in this position, and then also using knee bars as well. Knee bars are a really good technique, and you can see them more and more in climbing these days, and also outdoor climbing. So knee bars don't need your elbows, and it means you can really work those techniques as well. So I've had a really good success with other people in the past where they've used this time to just practice resting positions on the wall, including knee bars, hanging on bad holds. And you can sort of see how much rest you can get, because your elbow should probably be the thing that being one of the muscles and the joints which are being relaxed the most whilst you're in a resting position. So I think that's a really good use of time. Endurance climbing is also a really good thing to improve at this point. The thing you need to not do is try to make sure that you're not just hanging on bent arms all the time during endurance climbing. Make sure it's easy enough and you're flowing nice and easily between straight arms or straighter arms. And if you are going to bend your arms, that you move nice and smoothly to the next hold. What we're trying to avoid in the endurance climb, but also all of your training whilst you've got an elbow issue, is either jolty movements or lock-off positions. Deep lock-offs and really pushing in is really going to make those elbows flare up and make them much, much worse. So avoid doing that. And big jolty movements are also going to be something that makes the tendons flare up even worse. So try to avoid something too dynamic and too deep static movements around the elbow joint. Focusing on nice flowy movements is the best way forward whilst you've got elbow issues. So lastly, the thing we want to try and avoid is doing any sort of compression work and really squeezing. Squeezing in big slap moves between Flat holds is going to be something that really flares up those elbows as well. So try and stay on more positive holds that are secure, where you can move between them securely and not be pulling really wide slappy moves, compressing with your arms all the time, because that is something that can make them much, much worse. So the final thing to consider when training around elbow injuries is what kind of conditioning you're going to be doing. So one thing that you'll find out, depending on the injury, whether it's sort of a tennis elbow or a golfer's elbow, is what sort of movements really hurt it or create any sort of bad reactions the next day. So this can usually vary between pulling exercises or pushing. Most of the time, pushing exercises do tend to be okay, but there's a couple of things to watch out for. And then pulling exercises tend to make things a lot worse. The first thing I'd say is compression, like in the compression climbing, is something to avoid. Doing any compression movements where you've got a lot of leverage going out from your elbow is likely to cause a lot of issues, and it's something to be avoided. I'd also say any sort of unstable motions, like on TRX, is also something that requires a lot of stability in the elbows and shoulders. So it is something that could be avoided in the initial stages and then built in later on. The next thing is, can you do the same training without using any sort of movements and you're doing isometrics instead? A lot of dynamic movements on the elbows makes things a lot worse. So in the final stages of your rehab, you might want to rebuild in dynamic movements such as catches and more dynamic climbing. But initially, and trying to train around it, how do you keep your arms strong whilst not doing any sort of pull-ups? Well, a simple way is to do lock-offs. And this might feel uncomfortable at first, but it can actually produce really good results. Is rather than doing a pulling motion, you can just hold the same different positions, but in a lock-off instead. And doing that for a longer duration can actually be quite good for the muscles around your arms, but also look after your elbows as well. Once again, you've got to base this on how it feels after a couple of sessions, but doing static movements instead of pulling is actually a really good way to get stronger. You can do the same in a low row position, and you can do the same in any sort of bicep curl or hammer curl position as well, as long as you're not doing loads and loads of motions and volume. So just to summarize that, isometric pulling motions are better than concentric and eccentric for the time being. So the next thing to consider is how much load that you're putting through your elbows once again, and the speed of the contraction. So I would always recommend just going slightly easier in this conditioning phase, because if you go for lower volume and really high intensity of any motion, say like a deadlift with a barbell, it's going to be quite hard work for your elbows to keep up with. However, if you did the same thing but with low intensity and high volume, it's still going to be putting a lot of stress through your elbows. So try and focus on that sort of hypertrophy zone of 8 to 12 reps, but instead of doing it at a really high intensity, try and drop that down as well. So endurance intensity, hypertrophy sets, and that's more likely to give you a good result for the time being, doing some of the motions which don't cause issues. For example, with bench press or some sort of like chest fly. So the last thing to keep in mind when doing any sort of conditioning and trying to protect these elbow injuries is what's happening around those muscles. So a lot of elbow issues come down to tightness in the biceps, or it can be made worse by tightness in the biceps. So trying to make sure that these are being worked but also being released, so doing some sort of stretching and relaxation. But then that needs to continue all the way up into the shoulders. So something we see quite a lot is that any sort of shoulder issues will slowly work down into the elbows, and neck issues as well going down into the elbows. So it's really good to still be trying to work the shoulder muscles and try to loosen up, getting good posture, and also trying to work the rotator cuff and making sure that they're nice and strong. So a couple of exercises that I'd recommend are doing shoulder shrugs, because it means that you've got a straight arm, your elbows aren't particularly being worked, but you're working those upper trap muscles. And then also doing some sort of eyes-wise tees, so face down on the ground, doing eyes-wise tees, which will work your rotator cuff really well, those mid-back muscles, but also the elbows aren't under any sort of load. This is going to make sure that your chest is being stretched out, your rotator cuff's being worked really well, and your upper traps are being developed so that you're not being rounded forward, not rounding forward the shoulders, which can sometimes help create tightness in the biceps as well. So those three exercises are something I'd always sort of throw in if you've got elbow issues, because they're a great thing to do anyway, and they're not going to make it worse at all. So I hope you found that episode and all the information useful, and you'll be able to have a bit more information on how to train around elbow injuries in the future. I personally have had quite a few elbow injuries or issues with sort of golfers and tennis elbows over the years, and I know how frustrating it can be, but you really can still improve and work around it if you're careful and you take on some of this advice that I've covered in the episodes. So I hope you can still train and enjoy staying motivated and climb to your best of your abilities, and hopefully come out of this injury period stronger and better. If you've enjoyed the episode, it's really useful if you can subscribe to the channel and keep an eye out for the future episodes in this mini-series. We've still got the shoulder injuries and knee injuries and how to train around them coming up. And if you haven't already seen it, in the first episode, we cover how to train around finger injuries. So hopefully you're able to take this information, and I'll see you down the wall or the crag soon.